Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, Randy.
Since we founded Bombas, we've always said our socks, underwear, and T-shirts are super soft. Any new ideas?
Maybe sublimely soft.
Or disgustingly cozy.
Wait, what?
I got it. Bombas. Absurdly comfortable essentials for yourself
and for those facing homelessness.
Because one purchased equals one donated.
Wow, did we just write an ad?
Yes.
Bombas. Big comfort for everyone. Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonicist. Today I'm delighted to say that I've got a bit of a treat for you, and I'm bringing you a hotly anticipated interview taking a look at a cultural perspective. I'm very lucky to be joined by Clare Siviter, lecturer at Bristol University and expert in French theatre during the French Revolution and Napoleonic era. She's also the author of Tragedy and Nation in the Age of Napoleon. Clare, it's great to have you on. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you for caring. Tell us a little bit about your research, first of all.
So I'm a theatre historian, and what that means is I use theatre as a lens to study the way that governments and society work, or don't work, as that often turns out to be the case. And I focus largely on the longer revolutionary period in France. So I started working out on the Napoleonic era, and now I really want to put those findings in context. And so I'm working from the end of the Ancien regime, or the old regime in France, all the way through to the restoration of the monarchy after the fall of the empire. So theatre was a really important aspect of society during this period. And my students and I often say it's a bit like Netflix. That, you know, in terms of today's society, like, yes, not every single member of society went to the theatre, as not everyone has a Netflix account, but it's what people are discussing, what they're writing about, what they're reading about in the newspapers, what they're talking about in cafes and bars and with their friends. And so in that sense, kind of like, you know, it's playing a dominant role within culture at the time. And it's also important to remember that kind of theatre is not just a play text. If we go to a library today and we look at historical theatre, we get all of these printed play texts. So what I do in my research is I try and kind of bring all these different layers together and trace a play from its composition all the way through to its reception. So that goes through, you know, when the playwright first had the idea to write about this, or when someone told them, you know, I think it'd be a good idea if you wrote about that. Whether that be their patron or a member of the state, then the way that it progresses towards the theatre, when it's read at the theatre, accepted by them, the progression through censorship, and then the rehearsal process, the actual performance, and then how it's received by both audiences and then also by the critics. So although you might be looking at just one particular play, there's actually lots of different layers to it. And the other thing that really intrigues me about theatre at the time, especially during this period, is the role that it plays in terms of a social space. So as a member of an audience, you go to the theatre to see what's on stage, but because it's not that black box experience that we know today, the theatres remain lit. You could have a wander around, you could talk with your friends, you could have a look at what was going on. If you were rich, you'd probably be trying to do some showing off, you know, this is my newest dress, or I've got this material. And it's also a very immersive experience. So there were lots of cabal at the time, or members of the audience who supported a playwright or an actor, or hated them and wanted them to fall. So there's lots of booing going on, lots of applause going on at the same time. If we think of kind of like, a modern day pantomime, that's one of the atmospheres that you're getting. And it's also a great place to have a laugh and talk about the current state of affairs. And one of the things that I found in my research again and again is that theatre is not just this kind of state-sanctioned propaganda. People are also using it as a space to discuss what's going on, to gather, to have a bit of a laugh, a little bit of subversion. But because there's lots of you around, in many senses, it's quite safe. As long as you don't draw out your sword, that would definitely get the police to notice you. As long as you don't start any fights or try and steal anything. But, basically, as long as you don't trouble the order too much, you can have a good laugh about what was going on.
I've instantly got so many questions that I want to ask about this. Let's start with some of the basic ones. So why this period specifically? Why? Because you look at 1789 to 1815,
yeah, roughly.
Essentially. Why that and not, say, a little bit earlier, a little bit later?
Well, I came to the Napoleonic period through theatre rather than the other way around. So I'm dyslexic, and I discovered French, what we term French classical theatre, in my teens. So plays generally written under Louis XIII, Louis XIV during the 17th century. And I loved them. I just loved how kind of complex but simple they were. In French classical theatre, you've got like the unities of time, manner and space. They were nice and short, and there was lots of space around the text. From a dyslexic point of view, for me, that was lovely. And I was just really intrigued by the history of these plays. And so, I was like, right, I'd quite like to do a master's or a PhD. And I set around to doing lots of reading. And I realised that what interested me was not so much these plays in the context in which they were written, but their afterlives. And a really good moment to study that is obviously kind of the Revolution and the Napoleonic period. Because the Revolution essentially mutilates the canon and the works that we would now term classics. So it's all about novelty, renewing, purifying the repertoire, etc., about getting these Republican messages across. And then the Napoleonic period comes along and, first of all, tries to kind of heal some of this damage, or like undo some of the damage. And it tries to reinstill some sense of order. And it's in this order that I became really interested in, both in terms of what Napoleon was trying to do personally, and also those around him. And I think also it's quite neglected compared to other aspects of Napoleonic history. So, we know lots about the economy or about military history during this period, but what kind of people were laughing at, what they were going to watch, what people did in their spare time is not necessarily something that we have tons and tons of books about. So on the one hand, we get Napoleon's personal use of the theatre, so how he tries to shape his public image and to give himself a heritage using these plays, especially those in the 17th century, that link him with Louis XIV. But then also, because they're portraying stories from antiquity, it gives him an extra heritage all the way back to kind of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And for him, this is quite useful, because one of the things that he often gets told, or he's very worried about, is the fact he's born on Corsica, the year it came under French control. So he's French, he's kind of like head of the French army, but at the same time, he's not wholly French, or there's this worry that he's not wholly French. And his opponents often put the U back into Buonaparte, for example, to really kind of emphasize his Italian origins. So classical theatre in that sense is a really clever way for him to be like, I'm playing on this kind of semi-Italian heritage, but also kind of I'm wholly French. And look at me kind of like creating this heritage through Louis XIV, etc. So that fascinated me. And he was also really keen to see new plays being written, because it would be a way for him to show off both nationally and internationally, and for a way for his reign to be commemorated. So again, it's what Louis XIV was doing, so he thinks that this is a good idea as well. So that's what Napoleon is doing. And then on the other hand, we get kind of the slightly more diffuse sense of what theatre is being used for by lots of people around him as well. And one of the things that comes up again and again is how useful theatre is as a means of mass education. So lots of people had missed out on their studies during the revolution because there were other things going on, or if they hadn't received an education beforehand because there wasn't a national school system as we would know today. And one of the things that theatre allows the government to do is to teach the classics to the people, both French and by extension those of the ancient world, because these plays are based on extracts of the Iliad or the Aeneid, for example. And it's also a way to teach French and European history. There are other plays about that. And so kind of like if you're watching a play or if you're reading it, you're learning about these, it's obviously written in a very distinct narrative. I have lots of debates with my sister, who's a classicist by training, about, which version of Roman history we're talking about. But it's a way of educating people. So both for people reading these plays, attending the performances, but then also for the people reading the press at the time, because the press would have reviews and they would often give a synopsis of what happened in the play. So again, kind of like it's thinking about how all these strands come together. And so, yeah, that's essentially why I ended up focusing on the Napoleonic project. And then I was completely engrossed by everything that I read. And I was lucky enough to complete my PhD as part of the Arts and Humanities Research Council project on Napoleonic theatre, led by Professor Catherine Asprey at the University of Warwick. So that was obviously wonderful. There were lots of us over the space of several years working on Napoleonic theatre, and it was a really nice community to share ideas in.
It sounds fantastic. You've touched a little bit on my next question already, but you make the point sort of very early on in your book that we don't actually know a huge amount about theatre during the period. So kind of expand a little bit on what you said already, sort of set the scene for people, because certainly I'm quite ignorant about this, if I'm being honest, and I'm sure because it's not kind of widely known about, others will be kind of scratching their head saying, so what's actually going on? So what's happening in the theatre world before 1789, and how does that change with the revolution?
So pre-1789, the theatre world is pretty regulated in Paris. One of the things I'm trying to do with my current project is untangle Ancien Regime theatre in the provinces and how that's related to what's going on in Paris. But you can come back to me in several years' time.
I look forward to it.
So thinking about Paris for the moment, there are three main theatres. There's firstly the opera, and still going on today. The Comédie Française, also still going on today. And the Comédie Italienne, which is largely for comic operas. And these three theatres hold the monopoly over their specific genre. No one else in Paris is allowed to perform these plays or plays that belong to them. Though there's, if you look at the archives, there's lots of accusations that other theatres have. But the theory is, they have these monopolies. On the boulevard, there are some smaller and much more comic playhouses that perform pantomime or fair theatre, and they are kept in a lower kind of oppressed position because of these monopolies. There's also censorship and a censorship system in place to make sure that nothing too undesirable reaches the stage. And one of the famous examples of that is Beaumarchais' The Marriage of Figaro, for example, Le Mariage de Figaro, and the number of hurdles he had to jump through and the number of people who saw his different manuscripts in order for that to reach the stage. And it's worth mentioning as well that another bone of contention is that, unlike in Britain, French actors are excommunicated from the Catholic Church. So being an actor isn't necessarily, it brings you fame and glory and celebrity, but if you're lucky, in terms of the church, it's a religiously dubious career path to follow. And actors have a real issue with that, and their supporters do as well. And there are also some quite funny last-minute revivals, or if they had the time to repent, they would have repented and they would have become Catholics so they can be buried. But there is a real fear about the fact that you're excommunicated from the church if you decide to be an actor, by and large. And there are some big polemics about it and debates about it in the 18th century. But by the time we get to the Revolution, theoretically, this ought to be great for theatre. But it turns out quite quickly that theatre poses a massive problem for those in charge and those trying to think about the limits of freedom and how a new society should work. One of the first times we see this hurdle kind of really coming up is with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which passed in August 1789. And Article 11 of this guarantees freedom of speech, but in practice, this free speech is not extended to theatres. So, there is kind of like this kind of little get-out clause that kind of says in cases determined by the law. But, at this point, you're allowed to be, publishing newspapers or pamphlets, etc. But the theatre is still subjected to censorship, which a lot of people find very unfair. Likewise, the French by and large are now citizens rather than being subjects, but actors are not recognised as citizens immediately in August 1789. They have to wait until December that year to be recognised as fully fledged members of French society by acquiring the status. That said, during the Revolution, we do see a loosening up of what can be performed on the stage. So we start getting more plays about French history, about religion, for example. Those were two kind of topics that were very sensitive, given that the king had been in power through divine right. But the real turning point comes in January 1791 with the Le Chapelier law. And this law allows anyone to open a theatre as long as they declare themselves to the local authorities. So this is a watershed moment because those old monopolies are completely gone. That's what people have been campaigning for. And there was a real explosion in the number of theatres popping up all over Paris, and thus the number of plays being written as well. And there are literally thousands and thousands of works from this decade alone. It's a massive explosion. So this part of the revolution is often seen as being a real heyday for theatre. And as ever, when we use the term heyday, it means that afterwards things weren't quite so good. So as I hinted at before, the revolutionaries discovered that free speech and no censorship is a bit tricky to handle when it comes to theatre. And so as the revolution heats up, especially with the terror, we get the reintroduction of censorship. Throughout this period, actors, directors, and playwrights are arrested for subversion. And this has an impact on the repertoire because all of a sudden we get lots of patriotic, in inverted commas, plays. So, for example, in 1794, because if you're not performing a play that's overtly patriotic by this point, you could be denounced, and people were worried for their lives. So things cool down slightly with the end of the terror, but by that point, the government has learnt three really important lessons. The first is that theatre is a great vehicle for mass education, propaganda, and promoting certain messages. The second is that too many theatres is not a good thing. It makes it very difficult to control, and there's also worries about quality. And the third is that censorship is actually quite useful. So we see several of the people who'd been advocating for kind of the abolition of theatrical censorship in 1789 come 1797 being like, oh, actually, we might be wrong about this. There needs to be some form of control. And it's these three strands that really become apparent in the final stage of the revolution, so the Directory, and that continue under Napoleon as well.
Yeah, I mean, you've led exactly into where kind of my thought process is going with this, because Napoleon probably agreed with quite a lot of the principles underpinning those three things that you've just mentioned, because he did, in a number of respects, love his censorship and propaganda. Obviously, with the newspapers, they come down from, 80 down to 4 in Paris. And I mean, in fairness to him, he had a phenomenal talent when it came to propaganda, whether it was kind of with his own soldiers or with civilians. So how does that translate into theatre? Do we see Napoleon kind of continuing what happened under the revolution, or does he have his own unique niche that he tries to occupy with it?
I think he essentially draws on what worked well under the old regime of France and what worked well under the revolution, and tries to combine the two together. One of the things that I'm finding at the moment is it's really interesting to look at when and how we use terms like censorship and propaganda. And there's been a lot of talk about Napoleonic legend in France. People quite often talk about this idea of the black legend of Napoleon. Sorry, the Légion Noire, for example, and then he's been espoused by different political causes over the years. Then there have been other historical events like the Second Empire or World War II that impact how historians write about him. Nathalie Petitot has written brilliantly about this. looking at the course of Napoleonic historiography over time and the impacts of these different events. And David Bell has also recently pointed out that, yes, the Napoleonic regime was a totalitarian state, but not in the 20th century sense of the word. And also, for people who were living during that time, those who could remember the revolution, the height of the terror, you had denunciations that could lead to kind of like the loss of your life. There were families ripped apart. Thousands of people were executed. Thousands fled abroad. Under the old regime, you had the system of lettres de cachet, where if you were wealthy, a member of your family could just imprison you with the king's authority, no trial, etc. So I think we need to temper slightly kind of like how we're using these words. In the same vein, censorship was an inherent part of the composition process from the early modern period up until 1906 in France, bar very brief respites. In the UK, we had it until 1968, for example. So it's how we use these words. And I think with censorship, one of the things that have come up again, and by this point I've read hundreds, if not thousands, of censorship reports, is that, yes, it can be political. There are moments when we don't want royalists on stage, or we don't want this line because it could be seen to be making fun of this person in government, or to give support to Louis XVIII supporters, for example. But at the same time, sometimes it's also about quality. We get some censorship reports being like, this really just doesn't make the mark. If you want to perform it at the Comédie Française or the opera, it's just not high of good enough quality. By and large, it's fine for plays that aren't of that great quality to be performed in the minor theatres, because they just assume that they will be flops and then people forget about them. So it's how censorship works depending on the theatre. Napoleon sometimes gets involved when there's a play that comes to his attention in particular. But by and large, one of the issues he has in terms of how he uses the theatre is that you can't really put him on stage, as we might do with someone today, for example. So shortly after the 18th of Brumaire, there are a few plays that try and put Bonaparte on stage. I mean, obviously, this is a big political event that's just happened. Theatre is one of the key ways of expressing oneself at the time, so it's no surprise that we start seeing these plays spring up. But one of the issues is you can't really put living people on stage at the time. And this is whether they are a politician or whether they're a local tradesman, for example. There's this fear of putting putting people on stage if they're still alive. And then there's the other problem, and this comes back to the actors being like, who could be great enough to represent Napoleon? Actors were often figures with local reputations. And so if one of them performs Bonaparte, if we're looking at these plays after the 18th of Brumaire, or Napoleon later on in the regime, they're bringing all of this extra baggage and the other roles or the other incidents that they're known for to this portrayal of Napoleon. And that's really difficult for the state to control. So as a result of these factors, this type of circumstantial theatre portraying Bonaparte dies out very quickly. And what playwrights and theatres are left with is the regime of illusion.
So what does that look like in practice then?
So audiences at the time were very well trained to read in between the lines of plays and to look for allusions to the contemporary world. So even if you're watching something set in ancient Rome, you can instantly draw parallels to what is going on in the modern world. It's what people are trained to do when they're at the theatre. And in that sense, it didn't take very much to nudge them slightly further along in the state's intended direction. So one of the things Napoleon is really good at, which he doesn't get enough credit for, is choreography. He is brilliant at this. So we have reports early on in the Napoleonic period that it's actually really difficult to see Napoleon in person. And there are two relatively easy places to get a glimpse of him. One is at the reviews, and the second is at the theatre. But Napoleon wouldn't just turn up at the beginning along with everyone else. What he'd do is he'd wait for a particularly poignant moment of the play. Sometimes he had the script sent to him in advance, and he'd really kind of like wait for the specific line, and then he'd walk into his box. Obviously it was lit, the actors would stop on stage, the audience would turn to him, there'd be lots of applause, lots of congratulatory, he's finally arrived, etc. Lots of excitement. Then normally the actors would start that scene again, and so that would really allow Napoleon to drive the particular message of that scene or that play home. Then, of course, this would be written up in the press, and so that image of a moment in a theatrical event, which might just have been seen by the 1,500 people or so there, is actually kind of spread out across France. So the Journal du Débat, later the Journal de l'Empire, has a circulation at one point it's estimated of 100,000 copies. So it's really important to remember how one thing happening in the theatre can actually end up being kind of a national report in that sense. The other thing we can see Napoleon doing with his choreography is ordering specific plays. So one example is Cinna by Pierre Corneille, which is a 17th century tragedy, basically about mercy, but also being a great ruler. And Napoleon uses this and knows that the audiences are going to draw allusions, and then parallels in between what's happening on stage and then Napoleon himself. So he's really kind of like relying on the audience to do some of the work here, but also putting in a fair amount of work from his side as well. That said, allusions are all well and good, but one of the issues is that you can't control them. Imagine you're Napoleon, you can do everything possible within your power, but you can't actually control what someone thinks. We see several plays that are really quite successful, like Duval's Guillaume le Conquérant, but because audiences don't quite understand the play's messages in the right way, or someone in the audience starts laughing, starts subverting, getting the wrong image of Napoleon, and other people kind of like get the gist of this, some of these plays are subsequently banned. So Duval is a famous example, and it's mentioned in the works quite often that do treat theatre history of this period. But from looking at playwrights' personal correspondence and then their memoirs as well, we can see that kind of part of what playwrights wanted to do when they wrote a play was to kind of try and overstep the mark. They wanted to be slightly subversive and basically create a work that could have pro-Napoleonic meanings, definitely. That's how you're going to get your patronage, it's how you're going to get your pension and your reward from the state. But then also, because you're reliant on the audience coming, flocking along and paying for their tickets, you want a work that allows for a site of subversion, for people to come together, not for a political revolution, but just to have a good laugh and a nice cathartic moment, potentially some nostalgia bringing in, but essentially building something that people want to come and see and creating an experience you can't replicate elsewhere.
Wow. So in a sense, it's kind of, is it too much to say it's a bit like a sort of safety valve? It's an opportunity to let people let off a bit of steam. They kind of feel like they can go and have a joke, and so they don't feel like the censorship is quite as tight as it might actually have been.
I think that's quite a good way of looking at it. There are police in theatres, and there are lots of police reports. These reports are then sent all the way up the ranks, etc. So it's not an entirely free space. Obviously, if Napoleon is there as well, that's not a free space. But there's a lot of codified subversive behaviour going on. So I've read one police report, for example, where Napoleon's in attendance and two people who don't agree with him essentially put their hats on, which at this time is like a massive, massive insult. It's like the middle finger, and turn their backs to him. You couldn't have done that in the street, but because the theatre's really populated and crowded in that sense, they can easily hide afterwards. So it allows you to have this moment of kind of, I don't like you, I disagree with you, this moment of revolt, but within quite a safe environment. There are police present, they're looking at what people are doing, they're observing what people are doing, but by and large, you only really get arrested if you draw out your sword, attack someone, if you cause a massive risk, or kind of like if you were the leader of a massive misunderstanding that then leads to brawls outside. But apart from on those occasions, the police will observe, but there won't be that much punishment. And likewise for the playwrights, in the sense that there is self-censorship going on, there is censorship going on. Some people's plays are totally banned, but when there's a play that reaches a stage that ends up being taken in a very anti-Napoleonic vein, the repercussions sometimes aren't that great. Sometimes it's literally just a verbal telling off or, a slap on the hand. At other times they can be more severe and people feel that they need to go into self-exile. But the state actually doesn't, it relies more on people's own internal reactions to the threat of punishment rather than actually doling out punishment itself.
Interesting. You were talking about how Napoleon would kind of pitch up and, if you like, kind of crash the party with his grand arrival. How do different parties react to that? Because you've got the actors who are mid-scene and they've just delivered a significant moment or a punchline or whatever it is, and Napoleon basically ruins it all and they have to go back to the start of the scene. But on the other hand, for the actors and also the playwrights, it's great publicity. But then he's making it all about him and not them and their performance. So how do people sort of react to that?
If you're a playwright, Napoleon coming along is one of the best things that can happen to you because by and large, there's a rumour that he's going to turn up beforehand. So it means that it will be a very crowded performance. Lots of ticket sales means lots of money. The actors like that too as well. So in that sense, Napoleon turning up is very important. It also means that the work is endorsed by him, and that will mean that people will buy more copies of it, that, quite potentially later down the line, there's a pension coming along, for example, which could be, 6,000 francs. It's quite considerable money. And so in that sense, it's seen as a very good thing. And the actors are quite used to being interrupted because it's not this black box experience. There's lots of stuff going on. Sometimes members of the public throw notes onto the stage, or there's all this booing going on so that they have to repeat a line. One of the subversive things that audience members can do, there's lots of rulings outlawing this, is that if there's a particularly good line that has lots of resonances in the current situation, they ask for it to be repeated and again and again and again. And the police are like, no, you've said it once, you're not allowed to do it again. And the audience is like, again. So there is this interaction going on in between what's literally on stage and what's happening in the auditorium. Of course, not everyone was completely and utterly thrilled that Napoleon turned up, especially if you were part of the opposition. But it was just recognising that this was what was happening on that particular evening. In terms of, for the opposition, there's an account from 1804. I think it's the Duc de Choiseul, who has recently returned, and he turns up at the theatre, and all the royalists and members of the opposition kind of do the same thing that the pro-Napoleonic cabal would do for Napoleon, and they kind of say, this is a great person who's here, and he gets lots of attention from the audience. And the police are really astute in their reports about looking at which sections of the audience are looking at which prominent figures, for example. There's this whole observation game going on that's really important to them.
Interesting. Can I go back to something that you mentioned earlier, because you were talking about censorship reports and how some of the concerns are sort of legitimate concerns about quality and others are about kind of political messages and how that's going to make the state look. What's your sense of the balance between them? Is it quite a kind of even thing in terms of, look, we've got a pile of rubbish plays coming through here, we just don't want them at the main theatres, or is the focus much more on trying to sort of see off potential sources of discontent?
So before a play got to censorship, it had normally been read by the theatre and they'd accepted it. The theatre obviously wants to perform good plays. That, a good new play will mean kind of like a huge financial success. But then at the same time, they also need new copy. So if there's a particular drought, they start accepting plays that perhaps not great, but they need to have novelty in order to entice audiences. So by the time they come along to the censors, there are remarks about quality. As I said before, kind of like by and large in the minor theatres, they kind of let it go and they're like, well, it will be a flop anyway, so we don't need to worry about it that much. When it comes to the Comédie Française in particular, they are very kind of aware of how specific elements of the plays work, how they fit together, whether they obey kind of dramatic theory, for example. And it's important to them that they really do fit the right rubric because, of course, they're being presented at the National Theatre. It's kind of like this emblem of the nation. So that's when the kind of aesthetic worries start coming in. and this element of quality control. In terms of the political side of things, I mean, the way that I look at it at the moment is that in terms of the censorship reports, in terms of the ones that are totally banned, which actually isn't that many, it is normally on political grounds. In terms of modifications, a common response would be, yeah, your play is authorised, but you need to make changes on like page 5, 6, 16, whatever. And the censors would highlight which lines needed to be changed on the actual manuscript itself. Then a lot of these are about kind of like potential political resonances, or especially religious ones. One of the things they get particularly worried about is like Roman priests potentially wearing Catholic robes. Likewise, soldiers not wearing exactly the right uniform. So there's one point when a play is meant to be performing French soldiers, and they turn up in Austrian costumes. Yeah, that doesn't go very well. Or, kind of like where white starts appearing, white is the colour of the royalty. So if army officers as characters on stage start appearing in white, at one point the Minister for War gets involved, and he's like, this is not a legitimate army costume, not happening. So there's kind of like, they're on the lookout for things that could potentially go wrong. But one of the things they're also really concerned about, and this in a way comes back to the political side of it, that yes, I mean, overt references to the royalist cause are going to be removed. But what they're also looking for is essentially debatable points, things that are going to set the audience off. One side of the audience will be massively pro this, and one side of the audience will be massively against it. And that's when you can start getting troubles related to law and order. And that's essentially what the censors are trying to avoid at the most. It's this idea that audiences need to behave well. Like, yes, they can have a little laugh here and they can have some subversion here, but essentially this shouldn't trouble what's called l'ordre social. Society needs to be maintained, and this is really important to them, especially after the revolution. The revolution is seen as this moment when everything got out of control, and kind of like, this might have been because of the language that we were using or the political sentiments at the time. So essentially they don't want to wake any of this up, and we see this language in the reports, kind of like, we don't want to réveiller this element of public opinion, or kind of like give ideas to people about religious or political fanaticism. So there's almost this kind of using censorship to make sure the play conforms to social order, and that it's not going to set off any big fights or debates.
Interesting. And what about the people who are actually watching these? Because you've mentioned how these are big occasions, but they're also, in many cases, we're talking about the big theatres, which are going to be the most expensive institutions, as opposed to the ones where the lower quality plays are going to appear. So is it something where you have the best plays are only consumed by the wealthy? Do you see kind of rip-off versions and parodies happening elsewhere? What's the consumership like, if you're sort of trying to say? Yeah, so if we're looking at the kind of the main theatres in Paris, so one of the things that Napoleon does is he reintroduces these monopolies. This time there are 4 main theatres, and then there are 4 kind of secondary theatres come 1807. The tickets for the Grand Théâtre, the main theatres, were quite expensive, but at the same time there were lots of cheaper places, and there are numerous documents that show that there was a habit of leaving convenient doors open, allowing people to come in without paying. Kind of like there's so many letters being like, we told you to shut the door. And there's also practice at the time of actors or playwrights giving out free tickets to their supporters, to their cabal, so that they could go and cheer on or boo someone down for a specific play on a specific evening. So this is a great pastime of students, according to police records. Lots of very kind of enraged and active students. The boxes of the theatre are normally occupied by the upper classes and high civil servants. There's this idea, especially outside of Paris, that theatres need to be attracting the officer class of the armed forces and the high civil servants who have been sent on a mission to a particular area of France.
But it's worth remembering that those in the upper classes would also bring their servants along with them. So that particular individual is not paying for their specific ticket, but they're going along as part of an entourage in that sense. And then there are people who work in the theatre themselves, and from contemporary sources we can see that a lot of those people working backstage, or even who were musicians in the orchestra in the pit, for example, were illiterate, so they used crosses to sign their names. There's also lots of police orders about lemonade sellers. I don't know whether there's a particular thing that they had a massive issue with, and prostitutes, especially about where prostitutes are and aren't allowed to stand. They get very annoyed when they turn up in the boxes. So even within one theatre, you get a real cross-section of society in that sense. And it's worth remembering as well that people might go to more than one theatre in one particular evening. So you could go to kind of like the big theatres for the main event, the first play that evening, and then at half-time or the interval, you would then pop along to one of the more minor theatres and see something going on there as well. So it's kind of, people are moving about, and we need to remember this mobility in that sense. The authorities were also aware of how useful theatre was, and there were free performances as well, so gratis performances to mark certain events, victories, national celebrations, and at this point anyone could go. Likewise, the performances weren't just kept to the auditorium, so as I spoke about Napoleon earlier, critics would write about these and their accounts would appear in newspapers, they'd appear in the national press, then sometimes they were reprinted in the local press as well, so that even if you were in Marseille or Bordeaux, you had an idea of what was going on in the major theatres of the capital.
So in terms of trying to tap into popular opinion during this period, is your sense that a play will do well in a theatre because it taps into how the public wants to think about particular issues when it has a particular kind of spin on it, or is there something else at play?
I think there are particular themes that come back again and again that the public clearly love. So one of the historical characters they love to see on the stage is Henry IV. Kind of like the great King of France, man of the people, he ate his poule au pot, etc. Obviously there's been some rewriting of his history, but if you have a play with Henry IV in, you can be guaranteed that it will be a massive success. They love it, but at the same time, the Napoleonic regime is like, he's a king, and he has all the support, and he's a Bourbon, and the one in exile is also a Bourbon. So there are moments when they try and allow Henry IV to come to the stage, and they test this out at the opera and at the Comédie Française, and then they decide it's not quite the moment to bring Henry IV back. So there's specific figures like that who have a really popular following. Then there are certain elements of kind of like the greats of Western literature that people always like hearing about again and again. So like Hector, with my French pronunciation, or Hector, to use the English one, this idea of this great warrior who is fatally brought down by a flaw, kind of like thinking about what's going on with the military at the time, the fact that you can be the greatest of warriors, but finally you do lose is very relevant to a lot of people. And we see people working through themes of loss through plays as well, whether this be kind of like by hand, like annotating copies, or going to the theatre and really kind of like using theatre as a space for catharsis. There's a lot of satire, there's a lot of slapstick, it's funny. That's at the other end of the spectrum, but kind of like there are stock characters that appear again and again and again. So Quai Roussel is one, and you quite often get parodies of the new major hits, but using these stock figures like Quai Roussel. Harlequin comes up again and again, for example. So there are definitely kind of like stock characters that are known to get an audience going, but at the same time, the state's a bit wary about what happens if they become too eager to see a specific character.
So what changes in 1815 then? Do you see a return to sort of the pre-revolutionary themes and the ways of doing things, or do tragedies kind of have a role to play in coming to terms with France's defeat? Because the nation kind of has to have a reckoning with itself in terms of those who were very pro-Bonaparte and enjoyed the glory of empire, particularly the soldiery, and those who, particularly in 1815, were a bit kind of apathetic about Napoleon's return and weren't really fussed one way or the other. So does that kind of play out within theatre, or are there other issues at play?
It does play out within the theatre. So I will come back to something I was literally reading just before coming to this, the Bibliothèque Nationale, which is about Arnaud's Germanicus, but we can speak about that in a minute. But essentially, come 1815, I mean, there's 1814 and then there's 1815. So we get the first restoration, and it's like, yeah, we can perform all these plays that have been banned for a while. Massive celebration about royalty. France had nearly 2 centuries of successful theatre written under monarchs. There's a lot of monarch praising going on. So we see a lot of these plays coming back again, circumstantial plays as well. Then obviously Napoleon comes back, and they're like, oh, wait a sec. And then they bring out all of them like major hits of the Napoleonic period. So all of a sudden you get kind of like plays written for these specific regimes, but then also the pre-existing plays that those regimes decide to stage. So Tartuffe makes a big comeback under Louis the 18th, for example. It's all about hypocrisy and kind of like the omnipotent prince coming to kind of rectify everything. Obviously that was like really great in 1814, not great during the 100 Days. And then with the second restoration in 1815, again, we see kind of a wave of circumstantial plays. It gets tied into Louis the 18th Saint Day as well. Then in 1816, there's a Henry IV statue that's put back up again after the revolution. So we get loads of Henry IV plays that we know everyone's going to love. So in that sense, kind of, there are definite trends that we can trace. One of the issues for the Restoration government is that it's not the old regime anymore. Dramatic censorship continues. So theoretically, public censorship for published material is abolished in 1814. And come 1816, basically, it's only submitted to censorship if it's under 20 or 30 pages. There's a little bit of debate about that. But theatre censorship remains. And so the Restoration government is still controlling what gets to the stage. And the general consensus from what I've read at the moment is it's fine for that censorship to continue because Napoleon did it. It's a bit of a grey area, but he was the one who introduced it, so let's carry on. And let's not talk about it too much. But the major difference now is that if a play is censored, by and large, the authors can publish it and show kind of like the censorship that's going on and write about it as well. In terms of things that become less desirable, making fun of monarchs is not a great idea. Likewise, representing the church and making fun of religion, you've got the king who's back, is definitely off the cards. That being the massive hallmark of revolutionary theatre. Napoleon starts kind of dampening it, and then obviously with the Restoration that completely goes. It's also not okay really to talk about Napoleon until he dies. There's this anxiety that yes, he's on St Helena, but what happens if he comes back, because he came back last time. So during the first years of the Restoration, plays that could have any potential link to Napoleon are, the censors try to suppress them. If it turns out, and this is where I can come back to Germanicus, that a play ends up having Napoleonic allusions, then that's quite often shut down. So one of the things we see with Germanicus is that it's a play about ancient history written by Arnaud. Arnaud had been a friend of Napoleon. He'd been in his administration. He'd been a member of the equivalent of the Académie Française at the time. He was a really kind of like high prominent figure. And then he's exiled with the Restoration when they come back again. And even though he's exiled, his tragedy is allowed to be performed. And the play itself apparently has nothing to do with Napoleon whatsoever. Like, there are no allusions that could be potentially possible to him. But because of who the playwright is, the audience really kind of like get hold of this. And so you get the Bonapartist fraction of the audience turning up, and they are wearing white waistcoats and black scarves. And then you get kind of like the ultra royalists turning up, and they are wearing black waistcoats and white scarves as a way of kind of basically having a very visual confrontation, and it just ends up being this massive brawl. And the performances of Germanicus are banned thereafter, just for the reasons of social order. It's a threat to public health and safety. The other thing that we see during the Restoration that becomes really problematic, that hadn't been problematic in the same sense beforehand, is the representation of the English. So obviously there's the occupation going on. The Allied forces are there in that sense. And whereas beforehand it was fine to do a bit of English bashing, it's the neighbours, etc. Kind of people would laugh at it fairly innocently. This kind of like innocent laughter is definitely suppressed. Likewise, more serious dramas that start to have English characters or potentially evil English characters are suppressed. So obviously, because it's not a good idea to insult or mock your occupier, new plays aren't allowed to really mention this. If there's a way of changing a character or taking out a few lines, then that's what the censors would recommend. Otherwise, it's not being performed. Likewise, established classics like Voltaire's Tancred had to be removed from the repertoire because it painted an unfavourable image of the English. So that's something that's new that comes along with the Restoration.
Do you see a similar kind of thing for the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, or is it specifically the English because there is that tradition of conflict with the English and kind of that mutual bashing between the nations and jokes at each other's expense?
So one of the issues about the Austrians is how linked they are with the French monarchy. So obviously Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI, she was Austrian. Then obviously during the Napoleonic Wars, Austria was a major part of the coalitions. So there's an anxiety around representing Austrians on stage. One of the things that we see with the censorship reports for both the Napoleonic era and the Restoration era is essentially it's not too nice to bash anyone of any particular nationality. You've still got kind of ambassadors around in Paris, for example, they might be present. And especially after the revolution, there's this idea of kind of a little bit is fine, but by and large treat people how you'd like to be treated. What does change though is how different theatrical traditions are perceived. So for a long time, French theatre had been understood by the French as being like the preeminent form in Europe. And they enjoyed significant cultural hegemony in their eyes, at least, over, say, for example, the German traditions. They thought that Shakespeare was barbarian, so that's fine. You start to see this being contested by the end of the Empire, and then with the first years of the Restoration. And that's really interesting because it's combined with a military invasion. So you essentially have like a theoretical and a military invasion at the same time, which is a real kind of like challenge to people's identities. And, we thought for a long time that we were kind of like the victors in all of this, but actually that's not the case. And all of a sudden there are these foreign ideas coming in that challenge how we understand theatre, essentially. So Madame de Staël does this with de l'Allemagne, for example, but there are other publications that really suggest kind of reforming French theatre, essentially, to make it much more adapted for the people, for entertainment, to talk more about real life, essentially, rather than stuff that happened in the ancient world or in far off times, etc. So we can look at kind of like the theoretical worries, and then in terms of kind of like the representations of different nationalities, and people have drawn kind of like large or done like the broad brushwork for this. But one of the things I find really interesting to do is to look at the way that specific playwrights were received and how they were adapted or not, for example. And I've been working on Kotzebue with Annelies Senclies at Oxford recently, and looking at all the different translations that there are of his plays. So, technically it's in German, but it's translated into French, English, Russian, Dutch, Swedish, Danish, Italian, Spanish. I think there's all of them that we found at the moment. And they're massive successes with audiences. Likewise, the French playwright Pixel is staged in London. And again, in the German lands, Picard is another playwright who is adapted by Ifland, like one of the great German actors at the time, who's often linked with this kind of revival of German theatre, and this kind of like project of making a national German theatre. But he's adapting French plays. So if we look more at the nitty-gritty and kind of what's being performed and individual plays and playwrights, we can see that there's perhaps slightly more encounter than we might otherwise have first thought.
So do you see much exporting of French theatre, particularly when you've got areas of Napoleon's empire beyond the sort of natural borders of France, as it was described, occupation of sections of Germany, Italy, and so on? Do you see Europe kind of responding to French influences theatrically or not? So
it's important to add in this that there is a history of French theatre in princely courts in Europe during the 18th century, for example. So, kind of like French theatre is performed in St. Petersburg, it's performed in Vienna. There are also touring French troupes. So I've looked at the ones in Hamburg recently, for example. A lot of the princely courts had French troops as well as kind of like their own national ones. It wasn't just French troops in St. Petersburg and Moscow, for example. I think there were German actors as well. So it wasn't something that was necessarily kind of like brought with the advance of the Republic and then with the Empire and kind of instilled in people in that sense. Like there was a prehistory of it. But by the end of the 18th century, essentially this taste for French theatre had been on the wane, and a lot of these kind of theatres were starting to shut down. You get the creation of like national German theatres as well, which kind of like challenges this. Then with the revolution, especially in Brussels, they discover that it's a really useful way of kind of like converting people. In the German lands, they think it's going to be a brilliant way to teach them French and about French morals and behaviour and ideas about society. On the ground, language ends up being a massive problem. You can kind of like give loads of money to these French companies and say, come and look at how wonderful French theatre is. But if they'd rather go to watch the German theatre over the road and understand everything that's going on, they're going to go and do that. So at one point they kind of like try and limit the number of performances for the German companies. Likewise in Italy, obviously there's in the Italian states, there's a long history of theatre there, and you still get Italian performances, but then you also get French troops, French companies arriving to give performances. Part of this is to entertain the civil servants who are there and the officers who are there on behalf of France, but another part of it is meant to be teaching like language and how the French think essentially to the local inhabitants. And it's not a particularly successful operation. It's really interesting to look at and how kind of like the state thought it would work. But in practice, people would rather go and watch something that's written in their own language than go and listen to something that's in a foreign language. But at the same time, in thinking about the people who were stationed there on behalf of France, it's a really important way to make them feel connected to what's going on in Paris.
Claire, this has been so interesting. I could talk to you for another 3 hours on all of this. There's so much that I still want to know, but I learned a huge amount. I know the listeners will have too. Can you just remind us again about your book and where people can get it?
Yeah, so it was published in May 2020 with Oxford University Studies in the Enlightenment series from Liverpool University Press, and it's called Tragedy and Nation in the Age of Napoleon.
Fantastic. Definitely one for people's wish list. And thank you so much for joining me. This has been absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
That was the theatre historian Clare Siviter joining me to discuss theatre and censorship in Napoleonic France. You can follow Claire on Twitter at Clare Siviter. Claire is spelt C-L-A-R-E, so there's no I in there. Siviter, S-I-V-I-T-E-R. And as you've just heard, her book on French theatre, which I thoroughly recommend, is available to order online now. If you have any questions and comments, you can always join the discussion online, either via Twitter. You've heard Claire's details already. You can find me at zwhitehistory, or you can get involved at www.thenapoleonicwars.net/forum, where you'll also find a host of threads, discussions and resources relating to the period posted by followers from across the globe. If you're enjoying the Napoleonicists and have a couple of seconds to spare, it would be great if you could give us a review on your favourite podcast platform, even if it's just by clicking the number of stars that you'd give us. And thank you to everyone who supports this content with likes, retweets, Facebook shares, and through word of mouth. Your support honestly means the world. The Napoleonicist will return in a fortnight, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been The Napoleonicist, featuring Clare Siviter. Take care, my friends, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Want truly hydrated skin? Meet Osea's Body Care Breakthrough Hyaluronic Body Serum. It's clinically proven to increase hydration by 161%. It's lightweight, fast-absorbing, and delivers 24 hours of hydration for silky smooth skin without any sticky afterfeel. Treat your skin to clean, vegan skincare from Osea. Get 10% off your first order with code SUMMER at OseaMalibu.com. That's OSEA Malibu.com, code SUMMER.